Welcome back to the third video in our D3 loading data series. Quick recap, the first in this video series just looked at the basics about loading data into D3. We played with a tiny CSV file, and we're going to return to that today and work with it some more. The second video looked at the specific problem about how to run this stuff on your laptop computer or your desktop computer rather than on a server. Short answer, we start a baby tiny server. The third video today is about working with asynchronicity. That is to say, when we're loading data in D3, certain processes are going to happen asynchronously, and that's going to change the way that we write our code. So our quick agenda today, there are a few things that I want to work on. And number one is I just want to use that callback function that we were working with in the first video, especially to modify the raw CSV data. I pointed out in passing that it's importing numbers as strings, but today I'd like to convert them back to proper numbers. What I'd like to do in the code today is to add paragraphs to that body tag. So I would like my page to look something like this. I know this is a dumb header, but that's okay. In our CSV file, we've got oranges and apples and bananas and pears, and I just want to add some new paragraphs to our web page, to the body section of our web page. And I'd like to have a running total as well, right? 3, 5, 10, 11. And so in order to add those up, I need to have my counts be proper numbers rather than strings. Quick preview. Attempt number one is going to look perfectly logical, especially if we've come from a language like Python. And we'll talk our way through this. Just a quick caveat, it's not right. It's going to fail. And the reason it's going to fail is because we're not accommodating the asynchronous nature of the Ajax request. So number one is going to look perfect. If we were doing it in Python, it would be great. But here in JavaScript, it isn't going to work. So of course, we're going to go to attempt number two. We'll solve the problem. And actually, the problem is one line. We just move one line. It's going to be very, very, very easy. But the lesson of today is conceptual. I really want you to understand why this thing is asynchronous and what that means that it is asynchronous, so that you know how to move the code and change the code properly. So the big lesson here today is just learning to accommodate these asynchronous JavaScript processes. And whenever you see them occurring, we'll give a couple of hints about that. Just change your program accordingly. We just have to recognize the asynchronous nature of what's happening. A quick trip through etymology. Asynchronous really has three parts to that term, and if you haven't ever seen this term before, that maybe doesn't necessarily make sense, but chronos means time, and the syn prefix means same. So if two things are synchronous, that means that they're happening at the same time. The A at the beginning negates that. So asynchronous literally means not at the same time. And kind of the way that I'm going to approach it a little bit later is it's almost like a science fiction alternate reality plot, which is that two things in our program are going to occur in separate timelines. And if we kind of think about them as occurring in separate timelines, that clarifies the concept and allows us to write some better code. All right, well, here's our web page as we left it last time. I've already taken the liberty to start up my HTTP server, and so if that doesn't make any sense to you, go back and look at the last video and you can see what's happening. The problem that I'd like to address right now is visible here in the console window, which is that count is imported as a string rather than as a number. This is common in CSV. It happens in Python too all the time. It just doesn't know that those things are numbers. JavaScript has a couple of interesting ways to turn those strings back into numbers, and you can see those down here in the console log. The first is a function called parseInt, and if I pass it a string, I get an integer back. There is also a parsefloat function that you can use. But one of the really cool things about JavaScript is that there's a shorthand version for this. I can just put a plus sign in front of the string, and I will get back a number. It's really convenient, and that's the technique that I'm going to use here right now. So if I go back into my text editor and look at the library, you can see that I'm modifying one line here. This is on line 11. In the old version, we just pushed whatever the local variable data was onto the global variable data set. But what I want to do now is I want to actually create my customized JSON object. So I have two key value pairs here. The first key is fruit and the second key is count. I'm not doing anything with the first value. It's imported already as a string, and I'm just going to leave it as such. So I can access that by pointing to the local variable, which is data, and accessing the property called fruit. So data.fruit points me to that string. In count, however, I want to do what we call a typecast or a type conversion, and I want to change that from a string into a number. So I'm just going to put the plus sign in front of data.count, and that's going to change it from a string into a number. I'm still going to log that in the same way. All right, so if I come back to my web page, I reload my page after that change, you can see that the local data is still coming in as a string, but now if I go look at dataset, you'll notice that all of those counts have been converted into numbers, which is proper. That's exactly what I want to have happen. All right, well, here's our library. You'll notice that I've made a few modifications. In particular, I've added this new function called add paragraphs. If what's going on in here doesn't really make sense, go back and look at that data binding exercise because that'll explain to you what I'm doing here. But really in brief, I'm using D3 to select the body container, the body tag. I'm selecting all of the child paragraphs of body, of which there are 0, and to that set I am binding my global data set. Remember that has 4 rows in it, so there will be 4 new unbound data elements. Those go into the enter set, so I'm telling D3 I'd like to work with enter. For each element in that set, I want to append a new paragraph, and every paragraph should have the following text. That text is a callback function, and you'll notice that there is a local variable here called answer where I'm concatenating a string together. But because I want a running count, I have created a new variable called basket. I've defined that up top at line 8. That is in a global space. So I'm adding every new count to basket. So that will give me a running total. You will also notice on line 19 that I am logging to the console the length of data set. We know the correct answer for that. It should be 4. And just go back and review the CSV file if that doesn't make any sense. All right, so the next thing I need to do though is call add paragraphs. And I am going to call that right here on line 16. So if I were in Python, this is how this would work. JavaScript starts executing at the top, creates a couple of global variables, calls d3.csv, which loads the entire CSV file into a global variable called dataset. By the time I get to line 14, dataset should be populated. At line 16, I call a new paragraph, which is at line 18 to 31. And so in Python, what this should do is add 4 new paragraphs using the string in 26 to 29. All right, here's our web page just as we left it just a few moments ago, but I've changed the library now, and so what I should see, if television and movies have not lied to me, I should see 4 new paragraphs here when I reload this page. So let's try it out. Nothing. No paragraphs at all. So you'll notice here too, I'm still loading the local data exactly the way that I was before, but you'll notice at the top of the console log now, I have registered the length of the global variable data set, which is 0. And so if I ask the JavaScript console what data set is, now it tells me there are 4, and in fact, data set looks exactly as it should. It even says down there the length is 4. So what's happened? Well, this is all due to the asynchronicity. Let's take a closer look. let's animate this as a cartoon. If we can't draw things as a cartoon, they probably just don't exist in the real world. All right, let's go through some cast of characters here. Let's have this little guy down here. The guy is, he's JavaScript. All right. So JavaScript, as we know, executes its code from the top to the bottom. So let's imagine that as a kind of a timeline or as a race. JavaScript starts at the top, which is the left, and works its way to the bottom, which is on the right. And it goes at a certain pace. It goes at a certain speed. But we know that when JavaScript calls the d3.csv function, we know that d3 spins off another object. Yeah, that's Ajax. It's the Death Star, of course. We know that from the last video. This is obvious. Ajax works asynchronously. That's the big A in Ajax. It's asynchronous. And what that means is that Ajax lives on its own timeline, in its own alternate reality. Ajax is going to have a ton of work to do. And so Ajax just simply can't quite go as fast as JavaScript in the foreground. We saw this a little bit in the last video, right? We looked at the Google autocomplete. And so there we thought of the idea of a foreground and a background. In the foreground was me typing stuff into a box. In the background, Ajax is actually sending that text to Google and getting a response. Well, we've got a foreground and a background here too. Ajax is working in the background to load the CSV file. But in the foreground, it's not me typing anymore. It's actually JavaScript down at the bottom of the timeline here doing its own thing. But there's more. It isn't just that Ajax is in the background. That anonymous callback function is in the background as well. Yeah, I know. We know functions take input. There's a little kind of black box processing that happens, and then there's some output. So yeah, this is a little cartoon factory conveyor belt. Great, great, great. Can't wait for people to tune into the middle of this video and wonder what's going on. Okay, so the anonymous callback function lives in the background as well. It lives in the alternate timeline. But there's a little bit more that's going on here. In the middle, shared between those two timelines, is the global space. This is where all of those global variables go. So the background is pushing local data from the CSV file into a global variable called dataset, which exists in this yellow band here in the middle, right? And what happens is that these things are asynchronous. They're not synced up. They live in their own reality. So if we think about this as a little bit of a race, it kind of goes like this. The JavaScript in the foreground doesn't really have very much to do, and so it races through its code and finishes really, really quickly. The Ajax and the callback function in the background are working their diligent best to add new data into that global space. Let's reset this for a minute. If the JavaScript in the foreground can't access that global data yet, we suspect that our call to add paragraphs isn't in the right place. We're calling add paragraphs in the fast timeline, but we're calling that function before the asynchronous processes have had a chance to add data to the global dataset. So the solution seems pretty simple, and in fact it is. Add paragraphs is in the wrong place. We need to call add paragraphs in the slow timeline, not in the fast timeline. And so if we move that call to add paragraphs into the slow timeline, we will have better access to the data in the global space. Where to put it? Well, actually, that's pretty simple too. We just call add paragraphs in that anonymous callback function. The anonymous callback function is moving along the slow timeline. And so if it has the responsibility to call add paragraphs, there should be data in the global variable dataset. All right, well, here's our library. We know now that add paragraphs is in the wrong timeline. We need to put it up higher into the anonymous callback function. So I'm just going to cut it from here, and I'm going to paste it in the callback. Perfect. Now what happens is we push data here now on line 11 into the global dataset variable, and then we call add paragraphs. Add paragraphs will add a new paragraph into the body section, and then we'll come back and we'll just log the console data. And again, this line now into 13, logging that console data. In the long run, I probably don't want to do that anymore, but for now, let's just leave it and see what happens. All right, I'm going to save that, make sure I save it, and let's just drop back into our page. Here's our page as we last saw it. Let's just hit refresh and see what happens. Brilliant. Now we've got those 4 paragraphs. They have been properly added. We see a running count, 3, 5, 10, 11. And notice what's happening now down in the console log. I am still loading that local variable. You can see that it's local because the counts are all strings. So, I'm going to get rid of this in the long run. But notice what happens. That add paragraphs is actually getting called 4 times. So it's getting called repeatedly, one after another, after another, after another. The first time it gets called, there's only 1, and then there's 2, and then there's 3, etc., etc., etc. Well, why is that important? I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go down that path too far. But it all has to do with the way that D3 binds data. The first time add paragraphs is called, dataset only has 1 item. So it selects all the paragraphs. There were 0. I add a new one. Now there's 1. Return. Then we load the second row from the CSV file. We push it onto global dataset. We call add paragraphs. Now D3 selects all the existing paragraphs, but there's one of them. It binds the new dataset, which has 2 elements. So there's 1 element in dataset unbound. That goes into the enter set, and we append a new paragraph. So this is a great example of understanding how D3 binds data. Because add paragraphs doesn't just get called once, it actually gets called 4 different times. But D3 is smart enough to know which paragraphs already exist, and it's smart enough to figure out which paragraphs are yet unbound so that they can be added. Perfect. All right, let's wrap it up. A couple of takeaway lessons about asynchronicity today. Number 1, not everything is actually asynchronous, but Ajax is. And so since Ajax is so commonly used and it's used all the time in D3, we have to accommodate the asynchronicity of Ajax. And so what that means is we start to think about our code not just as one long sequential file, but actually as little modules or bits and pieces that live in different timelines. And as long as we can start to think about our code that way, we will know where to put things. The general rule of thumb, as you will have guessed already, is that anything that's working with loaded data needs to go into that anonymous callback function. It needs to be part of D3 load, whatever that's CSV or TSV or whatever you're using. And so what you'll see in established D3 code is that those callback functions actually get to be quite big. They start to do a lot of the heavy lifting in the D3 code and the D3 data viz. Right? We've seen this a little bit before in the past because event handlers are sort of asynchronous too. And once we get the hang of this idea of parts of our code living and existing in different timelines, I think event handlers make a lot more sense, right? So we can load in the foreground an entire JavaScript library, an entire JavaScript file, but that JavaScript file might be attaching event handlers to nodes in the DOM tree. Those nodes in the DOM tree are just waiting for users to click on them or drag them or mouse over them or do something. And so these processes about event handlers are always asynchronous. We're waiting for the user to do something. The last bit I would say is just use the console log when you're testing and debugging. when we started looking at JavaScript, we did a lot of things with document write, and I said at the time that's not a long run, a good solution in the long run. So just use the console log, and you can go into production. You can comment out those lines for the console log, or you can delete them entirely, and that's fine. All right, that's all there is for asynchronous lessons, and this is the last of those 3 videos on D3 loading. Thanks and good luck.